Okay, let's get started. Welcome to what I believe will be a very informative webinar on the use of drone Lidar in the form of Hovermap from Emesent to map the Rock, the infamous Alcatraz prison. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to attend. We will start with housekeeping, then a brief introduction, followed by a short presentation on the need for a holistic integrated data model that can scale from the globe to your desktop and support concepts like the integration of BIM and GIS, as well as much more. Most of the time will be for Dr. Jeremy Sifonia's presentation on the work he did to laser scan the complete Alcatraz prison and island. We're planning to have some time for Q&A. This is going to be both fun and educational. First, the usual housekeeping information. I'm sure you are familiar with all of this. Take a minute to review and be sure to use the Q&A for questions at the end. Okay, for those who I have not met, I'm Gene Rowe, the founder of Lidar News. I'm a civil engineer with main interest in surveying, engineering, and mapping. I started my career in surveying with a 100-foot steel tape and a plumb bob. So that should tell you something. As I mentioned, I'm going to explore the idea of integrating BIM and GIS. This is something I've been thinking about since my early days as a land surveyor in the late 1970s. Excuse me. When BIM was actually just CAD. We're fortunate today to have Dr. Jeremy Sifonia, field applications engineer for Emesent, and one of the team members who documented Alcatraz in 3D using the Hovermap and other laser scanning sensors. His PhD focused on the utility of SLAM-based LiDAR on unmanned aerial vehicles. More details on that in a moment. So I want to apologize. This topic really deserves a live audience that would allow for discussion, but we'll have to leave that for another time. From my early days teaching surveying at the University of New Hampshire in the 1970s, I've been interested in a more holistic, integrated approach to managing geospatial data for both the built environment and the natural environment. In other words, the entire planet. Back then, the two emerging software packages were AutoCAD for the built and ArcInfo for the natural. A group of us started designing the concept of what was to become ArcCAD, an underfunded attempt at combining GIS and CAD. This was in the early 80s. AutoCAD was 2D graphics only. ArcInfo had a database that could be used to search and query the objects in a map. It would take Revit to correct this major weakness in the CAD by adding intelligence to the drawing. So why do we need a data model? That's the main message here. In part because we need to program the database to add intelligence to the objects and to make sure all of the data is compatible. Esri has defined a data model, take us the next slide, for each of the vertical markets where they are doing business, and they continually update them. This is what is missing from our current built environment software offerings. I recently watched a Netflix miniseries, The $1 Billion Code. It's a true story about a startup in Germany. In 1991, Art plus Com developed a Planet browser. In 1993, they extended that to what was called TerraVision. I was shocked to see that this was my idea. In 2014, Art plus Com sued Google for patent infringement, claiming they had used TerraVision to develop Google Earth. Eventually, Google buried them in a legal morass, and eventually they lost the suit. But I highly recommend this series since it provides interesting details about this software. This is a pretty fuzzy example of the GIS Esri data model for GIS for the nation. There's a lot of research you can do on this. So here's a brief look at what I refer to as the new 3D World Geospatial Data Model. It's not a short title. Our current software platforms are all too narrowly focused and biased towards a specific functionality. Most workflows require as many as 5 or more software packages to complete a project. This results in lost productivity and the likelihood of errors that often don't show up until it's too late. Don't get me wrong, I applaud all the efforts and know what it takes to develop radically new ideas. But this has been done before. Take the PC, the internet, GPS, AutoCAD, Revit, AI. The list is a long one. If you're thinking this is at best a dream, to bring things back down to earth, let's just consider a new data model that focuses on integrating BIM and GIS. Notice I did not say BIM models or GIS systems. Those are a couple of my pet peeves. Work is being done to accomplish this by Esri and Autodesk, among others, but it is never going to be the same as starting from scratch with a new data model. In the early days of GIS, focus was on data quality. But today, at least for most people, when they hear the word data, it's more about quantity, particularly in the form of data centers being built to support the cloud. There is at least one exception: the quality of the data needed to train the machine learning algos. I could go on and on about this, but we want to get to the start of the show. So I'll leave you with a question. Could AI be used to design and spec out the new integrated geospatial data model? When I say new, I mean start with no code and a blank screen. I urge you to think about it and perhaps encourage some group to tackle this. This could change the world. Now I'd like to turn the session over to Dr. Jeremy Saponia for what I believe is one of the most impressive 3D laser scanning presentations that you've ever seen. Jeremy, I'm going to stop sharing and let you take over.
Thanks for that, Gene. And hello, everyone. Thanks very much for making time out of your day to join this webinar. It's been such a unique project to be part of that it's worth sharing. It's a really cool story, and what an amazing place. There's a lot to go through, so I won't waste too much time. We better just get into it. I'd like to start off by thanking Peter Gravatt.
You gotta share your screen, Jeremy.
Is it not sharing?
It's not sharing.
Oh, my apologies. Guess I didn't press the button.
There we go.
I guess I didn't press the button hard enough.
Yep.
My apologies.
And
well,
you got to go to presentation mode.
Struggling on this side.
There we go.
Yep. All right. Sorry, guys. Well, we'll skip that introduction. You've already heard it. This was the screen you should have seen. But yeah, let's get into it, given the time frames. I'd like to start off by thanking Peter Gravatt from the National Park Service and Pete Kelsey from VCTO Labs, who both facilitated and invited me to the project respectively. Alcatraz is a tough place. They say that if you break the rules, you go to prison. If you break prison's rules, you go to Alcatraz. So it was meant for the tough of the tough, the bad of the bad. And they had lots of rules and regulations, and this one always stuck out in my mind. Regulation number 5. You are entitled to food, clothing, shelter, and medical attention. Anything else you get is a privilege. Yeah, so if that sets the tone of the kind of place that you're walking into, yeah, you know it's a serious place. But I also like to have a step back and do a little bit of history lesson here, because that's what I experienced when I first got on site. I always thought about Alcatraz as this federal penitentiary, but in fact, for less than half of its existence, it was actually acting as that federal penitentiary. It initially started off in the 1850s during the time of the US Civil War. It was turned into a military fortress during that Civil War era to protect San Francisco Bay and the city of San Francisco. Through that period, it became a prisoner of war, or a place to keep prisoners from war, and that unfortunately included Native Americans during the Plains Wars in the 1870s. There's a group of Hopi Indians there in the image. In 1934, it transitioned into a federal penitentiary as we know of it as today as the Rock. But that's only part of the story. There are so many just really interesting stories and enthralling stories that have taken place there over the years that it was operating, and including the 1946 Battle of Alcatraz. And I have to admit, I wasn't very familiar with this, but essentially there was an attempted prison break, and a couple of guards were killed, a few inmates were killed. And at some point, even the US Marine Corps deployed a couple of platoons to the island to basically try to resolve the issue. In the image there at the bottom left, 1946, the part circled in red is actually a mortar team, and they're shelling the prison. And that damage, although painted over, is still visible on the western side today. You can actually see that if you go back to the island today. The most famous prison escape was the 1962 attempted escape by Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. This is the one where they carved out holes in their cells, went up through the utility corridor, got onto the roof, climbed back down. They had made a rubber raft out of raincoats and then escaped to the bay, never to be seen again. And there's always a lot of debate as to whether they made it. In 1963, the federal penitentiary closed, and I think it was just because it was in such poor condition, and it was time to reallocate prisoners to another location. In 1969, Native Americans occupied Alcatraz for several years, ultimately as an important step in gaining national attention to Native American issues and rights in the United States. So an important event in the history of the island as well. In 1972, it became part of the National Park Service and a part of the Golden Gate National Recreational Area. The site is 22 acres in size, about almost 9 hectares. I was tasked with scanning 14 building interiors. So not just the famous cell house, but all of the infrastructure that's on the island, including the power station, the morgue, and other types of places like that. We also walked around the exteriors to a certain extent to try to gap fill. So we knew that we were going to capture imagery from the drone. So in order to try to get imagery on the oblique angles and places that would be in shadow, we tried to find those overhanging environments and capture those with Hovermap as well. I guess this is an important part to say that Hovermap was a part of a great team of people that were assembled, including drone-based and terrestrial laser scanners, and it was all part of the puzzle, right? So Hovermap was the tool that I was using, Hovermap STX, in fact, 300 meters maximum range, 32 lasers. On first returns, it can have up to 600,000 points return per second, multiplied by 3, theoretically. It's a SLAM-based Lidar mapping system, which is perfect for GPS-denied operations. And the greatest strength in my mind about Hovermap is its versatile deployment. It literally doesn't care how it's being used. You can use it on a drone, you can walk with it, you can lower it down on a rope. And that means that we could get into places. If we can get Hovermap into that place, we can scan that place. And it's also very rapid and easy to use. So push of a button, the Hovermap, the LiDAR sensor on the front starts turning, you're capturing data. So as mentioned earlier, the purpose was to create a 3D model of the entire facility, with my role being mainly focused on interiors. The initial idea that was posed to me was that the National Park Service has it in mind to make a virtual tour of the island. And I think that's a great idea for lots of reasons, particularly for people who are not able to travel to Alcatraz, but also, perhaps some of that behind the scenes areas that are just strictly prohibited to the public. As part of this, as a 3D model, of course, there's engineering and restoration and preservation capabilities that you can derive from that information. And then, of course, the GPS denied capabilities of Hovermap meant that we could go virtually anywhere, indoors or out. The challenges are kind of hard to summarize. The scale and the complexity was something that was far, far past what I had imagined when first asked if I would participate. Yeah, we'll see some more of that a bit later. The other thing that I really hadn't anticipated was just the general public. The National Park Service had impressed upon us that, their experience was on the forefront, and that we were trying to minimize our impact on them as they were experiencing Alcatraz. So we really had to time our scans in a way that we didn't interact with the public. Fortunately for us, there was enough of the place that's inaccessible to the public that when there were business hours and the tourists were there, we could bounce off to some other location and capture data in there. And then when they would go home, we would go back to those more public spaces. Accessibility was another issue. A lot of the places, particularly those that are off limits to the public, are of course locked. And for the first couple of days, it was a bit of hit and miss as to where we would go. But then Pete was able to negotiate with the national parks, and they gave them this gigantic brass key. It was almost cartoonish. It was awesome. And this golden key, as we called it, opened up almost all the doors. It was very cool to have that, and it made our jobs a lot easier to be able to react and pivot throughout the day. Dirty and dangerous. Yeah, again, those places that are inaccessible to the public, they're generally like that for a reason. They're either dirty or slightly dangerous, or potentially dangerous, I should say. They're dark, and that made the scanning all that more challenging. And then I guess the last challenge was living on the island. So here you can see, this is D block, cell number 33. This is my room for the 3 weeks that we were there. And you might notice that there's a mosquito net. We didn't have those on the first day, but on day 2, we definitely did. I was very surprised to be eaten alive by mosquitoes in our cells on the first night. But yeah, there's no public facility. I mean, there's the public toilets for the tourists, but really this is not a place built for accommodation. Well, at least not anymore, right? And so you can see that there's no facilities in the cells. So we're having to, brush teeth and wash faces and things into the public restroom facilities. Meals were things that we could pack that were microwavable. Some of the guys had literally those dehydrated camping meals that they could cook up. So it was like camping inside of a prison. It was very surreal for the first week. And then after that, it kind of settled in, I guess, to a certain extent. The challenges were not just, living there and the scale and the complexity, but also just the island itself. This is San Francisco, so the weather can turn on a dime. And it always felt like we were going uphill. And it became kind of a running joke with us and the team and how many steps we were climbing per day, because it felt like we were always going up steps, right? So I took a very quick image with my phone, this video here, and it just shows you the 200 plus steps that you have to climb to get from the boat dock up to the main offices. But in the challenge department, it wasn't just the steps. Some places were pretty much inaccessible. So on the top left, you can see me hanging on the bars of the window. That's after I climbed a ladder. And then I scooched over to that little portal to my left, and that's the gun gallery. The gun gallery, one of the gun galleries, and that'll come up later. Bottom left is the utility corridor. This is the famous section between the cells that the 1962 escapees escaped into, and then they had to climb these pipes. And I was tasked with scanning that. And keep in mind that it's a 3-tier block, right? So when I was in the ground level, that wasn't a big deal, but you can just make out a wooden board, a plank rather, on the next level up. That's about a foot wide, or about 300 mil. And, you find yourself 2 floors up walking a 300 mil plank of wood, and you start to question whether or not this is a good idea. But I will say that it felt more dangerous than it was. Yeah, it just kind of felt wrong to be up there in the dark and scanning, but we're still here to tell the tale, and there was nothing super dangerous. Similarly, I was asked to scan this guard tower, and it was only when I got down to the ground that somebody pointed out to me the condition of the tower. And I thought, I'm glad that I didn't see that before I went up. But again, structurally fine, just unnerving. So the lighthouse, very famous, iconic aspect of Alcatraz Island. And it's actually the first lighthouse on the west coast of the United States. So it's quite old. It's actually still operational and run by the US Coast Guard, which meant that we had to get Coast Guard permission to enter it, which was very special because not even the national parks people can enter this space without Coast Guard approval. So in the middle section there, you can see me capturing some video while we're walking on the interior of the lighthouse. Of course, the obligatory selfie on the top right. And then on the bottom left, I wanted to try to capture the top of the lighthouse, and we attached Hovermap to its pole. There's a ladder that goes up there, but instead of trying to climb this ladder and being on the top of that tall lighthouse, I could just simply extend the boom pole and capture that data as needed in a much safer position and without all the health and safety aspects that might otherwise be incurred in that project. So it's all about the data, right? And so here's a short animation of the lighthouse. This is uncleaned. This is straight out of Hovermap, straight out of our Aura processing software. And I'm just cutting through the center of the lighthouse and turning now. And you can see the internals with the stairwell and the spiral steps, the windows, and even the top. You'll notice this in several scans on this slide deck, but there's also exterior components, and I'll explain why that's important in a minute. So the cell house, this is the star of the show, but in fact, you have to think about it. It's not just a cell house where the guys are held and sleeping. It's a microcosm. It's a self-contained world. So in this space are all of the cells, of course, but so is the showers, the dining hall, the cooking kitchen area, administration areas. There was a small performance theater up in the top right. You can see some of the chairs that are there now today. And underneath this is actually the remnants of the original Civil War era structure. And they call that the Citadel. So we scanned all of these rooms, and I think all up, it was about 20 scans or so. This is just a video of me going through the gun gallery that I had to climb up those bars to get. This is actually a really important area relative to the Battle of Alcatraz. We don't have time today to get into that, but basically the prisoners were able to get into this area. And once they were in this area, they were able to access weapons and then continue on with their attempted escape. I guess it's also worth pointing out that, again, this is yet another separate scan, right? So it's not just the cell blocks. And in this case, we did the ground level, then the tier 2, then tier 3, then the gun galleries, 2 of them, plus all these other aspects. So it actually turns into a quite large building complex scanning environment. The 1962 escape was a focus point of the team. And here we had access to the cells where the men were staying as they escaped. They had dug out the grills from the ventilation system underneath their sinks. They paper mached over top of them. They made these mask dummy heads into the beds. And then they escaped into the utility corridor that you can see there at the bottom. They then climbed up the pipes in complete darkness, complete silence, because you can imagine there's maybe 100 guys around you and guards, right? They got up to the top of the blocks, and then you can see in the top right where Pete's at, he's pointing the flashlight towards the ventilation. That goes to the roof. They pried that off and then got up onto the roof and made their way out. This is a shot from our software Aura, where you can see I'm trying to merge all of these data sets together. You can see them listed on the left-hand side, and from memory, I think it's about 26 scans, and they're represented here in individual colors. So each different color is a separate scan in that. Through the Aura software, we have this amazing merging tool. It's my favorite because you can take large areas and then bring them back together. So you can take large areas and you can break them up into smaller scans that are manageable, and then fuse them all back together seamlessly into a complete data set. So again, here we are. There's the auditorium. Just at the bottom, you can see the Citadel, D block, the isolation cells on the left. We're going down the middle of Broadway. There's the shower room. And then we're going to go into the dining area and the hospital's on the top floor. The hospital was something straight out of The Shining. It had lime green tiles, and much of the original instrumentation and medical equipment was still there. And I was in there all by myself, so it was really creepy, to say the least. And yeah, so we're just going to pan down, and we'll be able to see what it's like to kind of fly through the cell blocks here. And you can see that utility corridor in the middle of that cell block area there that the guys had climbed up through, and the Citadel. Right, so the cell block was interesting, but my nemesis became Building 64. And like I mentioned earlier, it's a self-contained type of place. And I didn't realize this before, but the guards and the warden and all of their families and their children, they all lived on the island. I guess commuting back and forth was impractical. And so they had built these accommodation blocks. And this is an example of one that's still standing today. It's called Building 64 on the map. So that's what we called it. And you can see that it's not in the best of condition. I think it took a bit of abuse in the 70s, but it probably wasn't in the best nick to begin with. But it included even, again, walking down wooden planks into the attic space, which was a bit unnerving. But this is also where Spot, the Boston Dynamics quadruped, the robotic dog, came into play. So Kyle from Boston Dynamics turned up with Spot, and instead of carrying the case and dragging it along, he just walked straight onto the Alcatraz ferry. So any of you who've ever been on that ferry, you can imagine what the tourists thought when this robotic dog was walking onto the deck. There's Kyle in the middle with Spot in one of the cells, and then this is Spot doing its work on level 4. And level 4 was important for Spot to be there because there were these big signs over all the doors about lead and asbestos contamination. So it was pretty much a no-go zone for people without all the PPE and all the paperwork and red tape that would be required to have entry permission. By using a robotic system like Spot with Hovermap, we were able to enter level 4 and map it without putting people at risk. So very quickly, in a couple of hours on site total, we were able to capture the data that we were after. And here's a screenshot of level 4. All of this was captured by Spot while we were standing outside safely along the side of the building. A quote there from Kyle. Hovermap deployed via Spot allows detailed scanning in areas where it is too dangerous for people to go. 100%. And that's what we used it for that day, and it worked a treat. So Building 64 was even bigger of a task. It was an even larger task than the cell house. I think there was 36 scans from memory, again, here colored by individual scans. There's 4 levels to this building, and each apartment block was scanned individually and then using the merging tool combined into a single model. Again, some exterior scans as well to try to get those overhanging environments from the balconies. So keeping in mind that we were here for the interiors. Again, if you notice on the bottom, those round shaped rooms, those are actually left over from the 1850s Civil War era. Those were ammunition stores, gunpowder stores, and part of the military citadel that was there at the time. You can see the complexity of the space. And I think all in all, it's hard to put a time on what it took to capture this because it was, again, opportunistic. When there were people in the cell house, we would come to Building 64 and places like that. But I would say all in all, probably spent the better part of 4 or 5 days working on Building 64. So capturing the LiDAR data was just task number 1. The second task is that it had been requested that all this be done in true color, so RGB color. And here's an example from the New Industries building. On the left is a photograph. On the right is the colorization process that we've applied into that space. So not just for the New Industries building, but all of the infrastructure, all of the places that we went was meant to be in color, which was quite challenging because these places aren't well lit, and if the camera doesn't have good lighting, then your color is not going to turn out well. So the boys back at Emesent had rigged up a special torch flashlight on the bottom of my Hovermap, so it illuminated my field of view, and it worked a treat. After colorization, the next step would be cleaning, right? And it's a bit dark, but I hope you can see that on the before side, there are a lot of tourists walking around in front of the lighthouse and in front of the cell block. These are ghosts, and they would normally take hours to clean up. But in Aura, we've got this amazing moving object removal tool. And simply with a click of a button in the after photo, you can see that almost all of them have disappeared. And somebody's asked me, well, why didn't they all disappear? So, well, they're not all walking around. Some people are standing there talking on their phone or taking a picture. So they're not going to be a moving object to remove. But you can see that it took out the vast majority, and what would take hours took me minutes. Really a nice tool. This is probably my favorite scan out of the lot. This is actually called the Quartermaster building. And as you can probably tell, it's still actually in use. They use it for stores, for the gift shop. They have all their tools and equipment for the landscaping and gardening and just general maintenance of the site. What I love about this shot is the lighting. You can see that couch down on the bottom left. The sun is just going through the window and just illuminating just so. And just by chance, everything's just super colorful. So it shows the complexity of the space, but also the color and the lighting capabilities of the true color. But the task in this case is about aligning the data to georeference. Now, we didn't have time to set up ground control points for my tasks. However, surveyors did turn up and they had ground control for the aerial portion, for the drone-based stuff. So when Phoenix Lidar had captured their data set, which is amazing, I had a georeferenced point cloud. And so all I had to do was fit my interiors to the same building using like a cloud-to-cloud registration, right? So here you can see this amazing data set from Phoenix. And what we're going to do is zoom into the quartermaster building here to show you that it is georeferenced. And you can see how adding some of that exterior scanning was important to get some better color on those oblique areas and some of the otherwise shadowed areas. Now, this building is 4 levels, so 4 scans. And the technique I used was simple: pick a level and scan partially into the next level above and or below it. So the idea is to have overlap between your multiple scans. That facilitates the merging process in Aura. It's a complex space, so I made sure that I went into all the nooks and crannies, pointing the GoPro at everything that I could. And you can even see the labels on the boxes. I think it just turned out so well. So this is pretty much the end result for this particular building, but then again, that has to be repeated, what, 13 more times, right? We don't have time to discuss that in today's talk, but of course, we went to other places and the same practice, the same techniques were being employed. We have the morgue in the top left, the model industries building, that's as opposed to the new industries building. Basically, this is where the prisoners would go to work and do tasks. They would make shoes and belts and uniforms for World War II and all kinds of tasks in there. And don't forget that second or third slide above. It was a privilege to work, and it could be taken away from you for bad behavior. Inside the new industries building, there's all kinds of displays about people who attempted to escape and the punishments that they received when they were caught. If you're ever on the island and you get inside the new industries building, try to do so. It's amazing. There's tunnel networks. Some are sealed off, some are not. The warden's house, unfortunately, was burned down in the 70s, but still an impressive building. We even scanned the little houses that are on the end of each end of the island. These are the foghorn houses. So we really tried to leave no stone unturned, including those underground ammunition stores and things from the Civil War era on the bottom right. So on the last day, or next to the last day, I pretty much finished up all my interior scans. And so I went a little bit nuts and I tried to capture as much of the exterior as I possibly could. And again, for just walking, I think that it did a pretty good job. And the idea was to be able to try to get these other areas that would be not visible from a drone-based perspective. This is part of the power station on the backside of the island, and you can see this kind of overhanging environments. You know, you just wouldn't be able to get that from a nadir top-down type of view. We also focused on places like the Yard. They have, you know, significance in the story of Alcatraz, and this is a place where people could recreate. I couldn't believe it. There's a couple of horseshoe pits in there. There's a baseball diamond, and it looked maybe like some shuffleboard as well, and just see some blue sky. But it was also considered a bit of a kind of a soft torture, because as these guys were incarcerated for sometimes decades, they could still look out at life happening in San Francisco. So they're stuck in this place, and they can watch the world still moving around within eyesight of the Yard. So a very somber kind of place in retrospect. And yeah, not a place that you'd want to be for more than 3 weeks. So we were there for 3 weeks, or Pete and I were there for 3 weeks. Other teams kind of came and went as we were there. And we needed all of that. If you do some quick math, you'll see that 3 weeks, 21 days, I had 14 buildings. So that's a day and a half per building. Now, some of them were very quick, like the morgue. It's not a very large building, but then other things like building 64 were time consuming. And our ability to be able to shift and pivot, to be able to maximize the utility of our day was critical. If the tourists weren't there, we were inside the cell house. If the tourists were around, we would go to these other places. That also meant working 12 to 16-hour days. We usually started around 5 o'clock, go down and have a bowl of instant oatmeal out of the microwave, have a cup of coffee, and get the Hovermap out of its box and start ready to roll. Trying to capture, again, mostly focusing on the cell house in those early and late hours. We didn't take a single day off. So, people ask me, how do they get to do projects like this? I said, you got to be willing to work for 3 weeks, 12 to 16 hours a day, and 0 days off, right? And that's just the data capture. When you're done, you need to be able to process that. And I captured 103 scans with Hovermap, and it's approximately 2 terabytes of data. And that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but what you find is that as you start processing it, you've got your raw data, and then you have processed data, and then you have folders that contain processed plus colored data, and then you start having processed, colored plus clean data, and it starts to add up quite a bit. So file management and structuring and naming is important. So lessons learned. At the time, we only supported a perspective view GoPro. So that made it challenging. We had to paint, the walls basically from floor to ceiling. So every bedroom, every kitchen, every closet I was in, for example, in Building 64. We really try to get every single place that we could get to make it as complete of a model as possible. Since then, which it hasn't been that long, but Emesent has come out with a 360 camera solution, which would have made life a lot easier, and mounted onto the backpack would have definitely saved a little bit of shoulder and arm strain, but it was all well worth it. Okay, the other thing that's important is if you're going to capture big data, you need a machine that can handle it, and most importantly is just tons of RAM. So as a very rough rule of thumb, for every gigabyte of data that you capture, then you'd want about a gigabyte of RAM. Just a rough rule, but it's a good one to go by. So if you're capturing 2 terabytes of data, and the cell house is, I don't know, 300 gigs worth of data or something like that, then you need a machine that's got that capability. And AMD provided that for us. Exterior scanning, we talked about that. And I think that seeing the data now after the fact, I wish I had done more of that. I guess we were just kind of doing it as we could, but I think a more focused effort in that front for those real tight spaces in nooks and crannies would have resulted in a more complete and better looking picture. Data organization and management. I don't think that I can emphasize this strongly enough. How's your files? What's your file structure look like? What are the names of your folders? When you go to a location, how are you naming your scans? We broke up buildings based on locations that could be easily identifiable. So I did the showers, for example, in one go, and then I did the hospital in another go, right? And try not to blend them too much, but also making sure that we had that overlap that I mentioned before. In Building 64, it's not only what level are you on, but even just what apartment you're in. And the short story there is, when you're tackling a project of this size and scale and complexity, you should think of your naming and your folder structure in a way that if you had to hand that to somebody who wasn't on site, who wasn't part of the project, and ask them to process and deliver the deliverables, to create the deliverables, that they would intuitively know where each scan goes. Yeah, it shouldn't have to be this big jigsaw puzzle that they have to figure out. And that's sorted as you go, or sorry, so that's sorted up front with your naming and your folder conventions. So a very special thanks to Boston Dynamics for donating Kyle and Spot for the day, so that we get Building 64 in that level 4 in a safe way. I mentioned AMD, and they had lent one of their thread rippers to the project. Absolutely amazing machine, and processing in all of that could have been done with a normal computer, but the merging of the cell house and the merging of Building 64 was only really possible with that AMD Threadripper. So thanks again to them. And of course, thanks to Emesent for believing in me, for believing in this project, for allocating the time, money, and resources to do this on behalf of the National Park Service. So with that, I'll hand back over to Eugene.
Hey, very good. Thank you, Jeremy. Amazing information. Okay, so I'm going to go back here to the Q&A. All right, and one of the interesting questions that I think came up was, can you go over briefly the gear and the equipment that you brought with you for 3 weeks? What did you pack? What do you wish you had packed?
Well, I wish I had packed a mosquito net because the first night would have gone better. But yeah, obviously brought the Hovermap STX, which is an awesome piece of kit. I brought the GoPro to attach on it for that RGB colorization. As I mentioned, the guys at Emesent had made this really sleek lighting rig for me so that I could illuminate the field of view. I didn't have to worry about illuminating the entire building or even the entire room. As long as the light was pointing where the GoPro was looking, as far as the GoPro was concerned, it was lit, right? So that was a real nice hack, I suppose. Brought the pole that came in handy into reaching into places and reaching up on the top of the lighthouse. And as far as equipment's concerned, that's pretty much all I brought. Um, camping gear and camping meals, that sort of thing. It wasn't really equipment intensive in that respect. So Hovermap, GoPro, and a few accessories to help us get into difficult places.
It's good. Okay, you used the GoPro camera to do the LiDAR colorizations. What software did you use to do that?
Yeah, good question. So that's actually built into the Aura software from Emesent. So Aura is a data processing software that the main objective is to create the point cloud. But it's also a viewer. So we can visualize the data that we have. And that comes in handy as well when we try to do things like merging. So we can do the pre-alignments and then run the merge process. And just another process within Aura is that true color. So you take your SD card out of the GoPro, copy the video images into the root directory of the folder, click on the color button, point to your data, and click start.
Wow, sounds pretty good. What was the largest amount of scans that you've merged?
That would be Building 64. It was incredible. I think it was, again, I think 30, 32 at least individual scans. So imagine that you had an apartment with 3 bedrooms, a bathroom, kitchen, living room, that sort of thing, right? Like a proper apartment house. And then multiply that by, I don't know, 30 or 32. Well, I guess it'd be about 30 because I also had to do the attic, right? And the sublevel from the Civil War era. So about 30 apartments in that building and bringing that all together. I mean, a normal project, you might be dealing with half of that or even less. So that was a large volume of data and probably the largest data set that I've ever captured and tried to merge into a single model.
Good. You mentioned Boston Dynamics Spot. Was that kind of more for show, and or was that a real sensor and system that you could use to really support the effort there?
Yeah, it was real. Emesent has partnered with Boston Dynamics in this respect and has integrated Hovermap with Spot. So Spot isn't just carrying around Hovermap as a dumb payload. Our advanced autonomy capabilities are integrated into Spot to actually control Spot. I was explaining this to a person yesterday as I was demonstrating the exact same capability here in the UK. And I said, imagine a horse and jockey. I said, Spot's the horse, Hovermap's the jockey, right? So all of the advanced features that Boston Dynamics have implemented, we use all of that. We use the camera systems and the control. Hovermap is there providing high-level commands and is able to, tell Spot, go left, go right, stop. And through that computer vision that Hovermap provides, it can navigate through unknown spaces without setting up QR codes or fiducials, without having control points and things like that. It can navigate by itself in unknown space. So when we were outside, you could simply use the Emesent Commander app to control Spot. And it's just about setting destinations. And it's Hovermap's job to get the robotic system there safely if it can. It knows how big its spot is. It knows its dimensions and things. It detects what platform it's on. So if a passageway is too narrow, it'll know that it won't fit. If you set a destination inside of a wall, it can see the walls and it knows not to run into walls, right? And it can navigate around any obstacles that are in the room. So no, that was a real thing. And yeah, level 4 was kind of forbidden for people to enter. And Spot was an amazing tool to be able to bring to bear to get that data and do so safely.
Sounds good. Lack of lighting. This question or ask could be a huge problem. Can you describe the rigs that you use to overcome this?
Yeah, I wish I had my Hovermap. It's in a box just on the floor over here. But basically, the guys had developed they 3D printed me out a special handle. And so it just snapped into the handle just like it normally does with Hovermap. But on the bottom part was quite a decent sized, very, very bright LED light. Now, I had to carry a second battery. So when you're walking around with Hovermap, I had a Hovermap's battery in one pocket and I had the lights battery in my other pocket. But yeah, the idea was that you don't have to worry about illuminating the entire space. You just have to illuminate the field of view of the GoPro. Nothing else really matters in that respect. So it's not as challenging as you might think in the fact that a bright enough light positioned at the right angle underneath Hovermap, illuminating the field of view of the GoPro is all you really need. And if people have questions about that and that setup, then I encourage them to reach out to Emesent and we can give them some insights as to what the boys had put together for me.
Sounds good. I think that wraps up the questions. We're going to just have a little plug here for what's called the Younger Geospatial Professionals. This is a LinkedIn group, and I encourage both younger and older professionals to join this and to share information. It's kind of one of my projects. So we want to thank you for attending. Here's Jeremy's email address, mine if you need it. And please let us know what you think via the exit survey. That really helps us to do a better job. So that's going to do it for today. Thanks, Jeremy, for a tremendous presentation and for incredible amount of work. I don't think I'd be too happy about 3 weeks on Alcatraz and any reason. So
we were really happy to be there, but we were also happy when we were finished.
Yeah, I bet. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll hit the magic button.